Good afternoon. Thank you for joining me. It will be my last reading from Chapter 5 of Sacred Chaos, Reflections on God's Shadow and the Dark Self by Francoise O'Kane. And today I'm going to go back to read the segment immediately before Gethsemane, which is entitled The Innocent. In order to outline the archetypal foundation of some of the points discussed above, I turn now to another tale, Percival, Cap of Rushes, or Cinderella, Inanna, and even the peasant living close to nature, or the Eskimo novice rubbing his stones, are guided by a complete self, by an instinctive knowledge of what is right. In folktales, the type of hero that best corresponds to this archetype, that of the divine child, as we shall see, is the innocent or dumbling who makes one mistake after the other, but eventually brings back the treasure or marries the king's daughter. Whereas his more clever brothers come back empty-handed, it often looks as if everything is happening against him and for the other figures. But by following his instinct, he paradoxically makes his way. I've chosen a tale in which this motif occurs in its most elementary form, Hans in luck. Here is a summary. After working 7 years for a master, Hans decides to go back home. He receives as wages a piece of gold as big as his head. He gets underway carrying the gold on his shoulder. After some time, he meets a rider on a smart horse who tells him he will trade his horse for the gold. Hans is very tired of carrying the gold, and he accepts. The horse starts trotting and throws our hero off the saddle. It would have run off had not a peasant who was passing with his cow held him back. Hans complains about the horse's vigor and agrees to trade it for the cow. He is delighted as he is thinking of milk, of the butter and cheese that he will be eating. As he walks further, it gets very hot and he feels tired and thirsty. But when he tries to milk the cow, he receives an enormous blow from one of her hooves and faints. When he comes round, a butcher gives him a drink and tells him that his cow will never give milk because it is far too old. Hans agrees to trade the cow for a pig, and later the pig for a goose offered by a young boy. As he arrives in a village with his goose, he sees a sharpener with his grindstone. He tells him his story, and the sharpener convinces him that he should practice the same trade so as to always have enough money. Hans gives the sharpener his goose and takes the grindstone. He goes on this way, but the stone is heavy and he is tired. He puts it down on the edge of a fountain while he is drinking, and the stone falls into the water. Hans thanks the Lord for having delivered him of a heavy burden and walks on empty-handed on his way home to his mother, unquote. Although other tales of this type use different motifs, they all follow the same schema. The hero enters foolish bargains and trades what he owns for objects of lesser value, each time pleased to have made such a good deal. In this grim version, Hans is delighted, for instance, at not having to walk any longer, the horse, having enough to drink and to eat, the cow, having meat, the pig, feathers for his pillow, the goose, and enough money, thanks to the grindstone. And after he has lost everything, he is pleased of being rid of his burden. The task ends with these sentences, quote, "There is no man under the sun so fortunate as I," he cried out. With a light heart and free from every burden, he now ran on until he was with his mother at home, unquote. Hello, welcome, good afternoon. Greetings from Chichen Itza. Carlos, you're traveling. just watch for those headless soccer games. Hello, Joshua. Thank you for joining me. Okay, reading on. We might readily apply this tale to our materialistic society, but I have chosen to interpret it with the regard to the archetype of the divine child. The image of the stone slowly grinding monotonously seems to echo the eternal dimension of this child and the passage of time, which, in other narratives, is symbolized by the motif of the spinning woman whose fingers guide the threads of destiny. With every new bargain, Hans is delighted that he has received exactly what he needs and feels blessed by fate. He has not taken account of the intrinsic value of the objects or animals, but values their usefulness in relation to their concrete potential in his current situation. His instinct tells him that each bargain is right, and he does not care whether a collective system of norms would see things differently. According to these norms, his bargains are, of course, foolish. He is a naive character who is constantly being cheated, but his naivety does not prevent him from making his way home, from reaching the place where he can be himself. I do not see the tale as ending with a negative regression. Even though Hans returns to his mother, in another version, he goes home to his wife and wins a wager when his wife does not get angry at his having lost everything. Rather, it would seem that by progressively surrendering material possessions, or more precisely, by discovering the potential in what he has at the time, he gets closer to a situation in which he will be in harmony with and nourished by the self. The tale obviously introduces negative experiences in a rather mild way. That is, the apparent value of the objects keeps diminishing. However, if we try to imagine what the situation of some analyses would be after their However, if we try to imagine what the situation of some analyses would be after these successive losses, we can easily feel their anguish and maybe their rage. Less grounded in the unconscious than Hans, they would inevitably feel that a dark fate keeps trying to destroy them by progressively depriving them of possessions they value. Whereas our hero's trusting attitude toward fate, together with his conviction that what is happening to him cannot be entirely negative, place him within the realms of both the positive pole of the self and the divine child archetype. According to Jung, this archetype has different aspects. Quote, "It is a striking paradox in all child myths that the child is on the one hand delivered helpless into the power of terrible enemies, and in continual danger of extinction, while on the other hand, he possesses powers far exceeding those of ordinary humanity. The child is born out of the womb of the unconscious, begotten out of the depths of human nature, or rather, out of living nature herself. It is a personification of vital forces quite outside the limited range of our conscious mind, of ways and impossibilities of which our considered conscious mind knows nothing, a wholeness which embraces the very depths of nature. Unquote. The above passage comes from a section titled The Invincibility of the Child. The notion of invincibility must be understood in a restrictive sense, for the divine child does not acquire powers by conquering evil, but because its nature is such that it goes beyond evil by including it. The archetype in all its numinosity implies the tremendous and the unfathomable, whereas the reality in which Lucky Hans lives is much simpler. But since he is being guided by the divine child, he is in contact with the essence of nature, his instincts, and a totality that transcends him. This transcendent dimension is described by Jung. Quote, "The child is therefore renatus in novum infantiam. It is thus both beginning and end, an initial and a terminal creature. The initial creature existed before man was, and the terminal creature will be when man is not. Psychologically speaking, this means that the child symbolizes the preconscious and the postconscious essence of man. His preconscious essence is the unconscious state of earliest childhood. His postconscious essence is an anticipation by analogy of life after death. In this idea, the all-embracing nature of psychic wholeness is expressed. Wholeness, empirically speaking, is therefore of immeasurable extent, older and younger than consciousness, and enfolding it in time and space. This is no speculation, but an immediate psychic experience." I'll just look at your comments. Rise says, "I have a question. Does the hero have some kind of relationship to the soul's shadow?" I think you probably should have watched the Star Wars movies for that, because the father of the hero is Darth Vader. And so, yes, the hero always has a relationship to the shadow. At this level, one may say that the child knows contact with archetypal energy and instinctive wisdom allows the child to reconcile conscious and unconscious forces, to keep in touch with both light and darkness. Like the self, the child is the most adequate representation of the vitality that can potentially overcome death by integrating it. The child's instinctive simplicity is the source. The child's instinctive simplicity is the source of a strength greater than that of the hero. Smaller than small, yet bigger than big, the child can overcome darkness, unify, create, recreate, and save. The divine child archetype may not be too far remote from that of the fool. Affinities certainly connect them, in that, for instance, both know how to move in the world of instincts. But I see Lucky Hans as being endowed with a talent that Percival probably lacked. He is able to transform a negative situation since, by relating it to powers that transcend it, he is able to give its contents, both positive and negative, a place within a dimension that goes far beyond consciousness. Within the divine child, the light and the dark poles are so close to each other that, as soon as one is constellated, so is the other. Percival and Cap of Rushes followed an instinct that allowed them to cope with a given temporary situation. For Hans, each situation just is, each stage of his journey having an intrinsic value. Of course, the conscious attitude symbolized by Percival and Lucky Hans can be present only in an individual who feels sufficiently contained in a fecund cosmos and who is able to trust in destiny despite obstacles or misfortune. In other words, it requires a positive mother complex, a secure background. Many analyses suffer precisely because they lack this positive grounding. Yet even when this dimension is lacking or difficult to contact, I believe that the analyst needs to keep in mind the importance of a childlike attitude, or risk not nurturing certain potentials for transformation. Contact with the fool and the child may be established through the unconscious, both in the symbolic material and in the countertransference relationship. An awareness of its importance implies, at least on the part of the analyst, an open, almost naive belief that anything is possible and that irrational elements play an essential role. This approach balances a more pessimistic, less flexible conscious attitude. And finally, awareness of the fool or child reminds us that appearances may deceive and that the negativism present in the foreground may hide deeper values that are waiting for the propitious time to become concrete. One may object that I am not being very logical, having stressed from the beginning the importance of a confrontation with the dark pole of the self, and having considered healing to result not just from a constellation of the positive. I have now introduced the images of the Grail Quest and Lucky Hans as underlying rather positive, healthy elements. However, both the archetype of the fool and that of the divine child are characterized by their containing both poles of the self without the ego having to affect choices. The fool does not ask too many questions and simply accepts that the extremes of light and dark can be simultaneously present. He does not reunite the opposites, but attributes equal importance to them. This is thus a strong tension, but this does not prevent the fool from acting on impulse without taking account of collective values. The divine child is the opposites, holding both poles within, extremely close to one another. The foregoing may explain why, as soon as these two archetypes are constellated, the psyche is better able to confront the negative without dichotomization or repression. What is more, the analyst's task is also to help the analysand connect with a more complete self, which requires more than a simple compensation of the dark side of the psyche. A journey is needed into the negative aspects at an archetypal level. The archetypes of the fool and the divine child allow this passage. As components on which the propitious attitude may be grounded, they lead the analysand along an axis that includes hope. As for the novice, Inanna and, as we shall see, Christ in Gethsemane, they are closer to an axis modulated by despair and may thus teach the analysand how to accept this despair. They may also help compensate the need for perfection that so many clients manifest, trapped as they are in a normative system that keeps asking for achievements. Happiness and objective progress, they tend to, sorry, I misread that. I'll go back. They may also help compensate the need for perfection that so many clients manifest, trapped as they are in a normative system that keeps asking for achievements, happiness, and objective progress. They tend to transfer to the analysis the conviction that others, including the analyst, will love them only if they are happy or achieve something. The notions of surrender to despair, initiatic passivity, and acceptance of the dark pole may contribute to an evolution of this attitude. They may also help the analysand avoid resignation. To return to the divine child, a further distinction seems useful, that between a childish attitude and a childlike outlook on psychic reality. Let me read that again. To return to the divine child, a further distinction seems useful, that between a childish attitude and a childlike outlook on psychic reality. To encourage the first in an analysand could create dependencies and provoke sterile regressions. To develop the second involves giving the right place to the child within the adult psyche without rendering the individual helpless. The mother, the good enough mother of D.W. Winnicott, does not invest herself completely in her child, nor seek to prolong the childhood period. She gives the child a chance to develop and to leave her, while keeping enough innocence to rely on more than conscious rationality. It is only then that the individual will be able to rely on being secure within a nourishing archetypal mother and to trust a transcendent dimension. The case of Patrick, discussed in chapter 4, at first a bad example of a quest in which the archetype of the divine child played an essential role, at least compared to the way it manifests in the tale of Lucky Hans. In Patrick's inner process, the constellation of this archetype must be understood as a compensation. His ego, drowned in negative tendencies and haunted by dreams in which one child after the other was being harmed, could only rely on the power of a divine child to counterbalance the situation. Psychologically speaking, the more the ego loses the battle against the attacks from the negative pole of the self, the more urgent it becomes that it should accept it rather than try to escape, and especially that it remain in close contact with the self. The divine child symbolizes a complete self at a very early stage, and its constellation serves as a bridge to this self. In Patrick's case, this constellation remained entirely unspoken during the sessions, as the analytic dimension of the whole process was in any case, but it manifested in emotional interactions, in body language, and in images which served to support the process. Once Patrick had surrendered to regression and depression, other unconscious forces were mobilized, and he was gradually able to feel safer. He is, of course, still far from trusting life, but he has discovered that losses do not always imply a disaster. He has acquired an underlying feeling of being part of the human group and has developed a solidarity toward at least some segments of this group. It may have been, in fact, that during the whole time of his rebellion and aggressive behavior, his attitude remained one based purely on emotion and instinct, as opposed, for instance, to a rationally critical stance, which made it possible for the analysis to intervene. Accordingly, the tone of his emotions has changed, and he no longer perceives his own life in destructive terms only. Okay, I have not read chapter 4, and I apologize for that, but I hope that you could have gotten enough out of this reading. I was reading from chapter 5 of Sacred Chaos, Reflections on God's Shadow and the Dark Self by Francoise O'Kane, and I've now completed it. The next section is Gethsemane, which I had read yesterday. Now, I'll answer any questions you may have. Briefly, we will be having a live session tonight at 8 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time, if you wish to join us. And Truth Seeker, can we still save the U.S.? The U.S. will definitely be saved, I assure you. And the reason I know that is because the psychological process is thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And so what will happen is that we have these two warring sides, our national political neurosis, which is quite serious and dangerous, of course, but they're ultimately evolving in the collective unconscious, and ultimately there will be a synthesis, and it won't be entirely satisfactory to everyone, but it will be satisfactory to most of us. And so the synthesis, provided we have a fair election next November, will be at that moment the synthesis for the country. And once that synthesis is accomplished, then it becomes the fourth thing, which is the new dimension, which will be the movement toward the 2022 and 2024 elections. And so that will be a new thesis and a new antithesis, which will result in a new synthesis going forward. So these changes take time, but they do occur. And I just want to take note of the fact that the political sides have actually changed entirely, at least twice since the time of Abraham Lincoln, and maybe more than that, at least twice, though, because Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, and so all Republicans were pretty much against slavery at the time of Abraham Lincoln, and they were fighting the Democrats who were in the South. But nowadays you find the Democrats in the North, and they've become the Republicans, and the Republicans have become the Democrats, and they're now in the South. So there's at least that one flip-flop in the last 150 years in American society, and there will probably be more. I'm already seeing signs of this enantiodromia, what Dr. Jung called enantiodromia, which is the tendency of things to turn into their opposite. And, I'm seeing signs of things pulling apart and then coming back together in a new form. And that is an ongoing process. It never stops. And, it's a process you'll see throughout your lifetime. But things may change and seem better for a period of time. Certainly, things were looking very bad, let's say, at the time of the Great Depression and Black Tuesday in 1929, or Black Thursday, I guess it was, Black Tuesday in 1929. And that caused a Great Depression, which was not well handled not as well handled as the 2008 crisis was handled. And basically the economy was fundamentally only saved by World War II and then the return of the troops from World War II, which caused the economy to start booming again. And so there was a very good and peaceful time after World War II until the mid-1960s, with the exception of the Korean War, of course, but the Korean War was an outlier. It wasn't directly part of the politics of the United States per se. But then the Vietnam War obviously very definitely was. Okay, so let's see what else we have. Vixen Dixon says, what kind of archetypal role Lucifer's rebellion against the rule of God fulfills? Do you see it as a positive or a negative one? Well, I guess we have to ask when you're talking about Lucifer, because Lucifer is light bringer. And so even though our current president is unliked, let's say, by many Americans, the fact is that his phenomenon in our politics has brought light to us in terms of what underlying forces are going on in the United States, in terms of our politics and our unconscious politics that maybe many of us were not aware of before. And so the fact that he has been a light bringer may suggest that he's doing a good thing and not a negative thing. And that's all in the eyes of the beholder. And we'll all make our judgments on that point on, I guess it's November 9th of next year, or November 2nd or November 9th, I can't remember. So Lucifer is a balancing agent also. In other words, the dark side is a balancing agent. And dark doesn't mean necessarily bad, it only means not conscious. And so the dark side brings to our attention things that we need to pay attention to. And the result of the fact that friction happens in our collective unconscious and in our country means that the United States has steadily increased in its power and in its economy since inception. And it's going to continue to do so. And Dr. Jung felt that the Western democracies were the one gleam of hope for humanity, because societies that don't allow conflict, and our debate is our conflict these days, thank goodness, not as much violence as there was at the time of the Civil War, but because our societies allow this back and forth, we generally choose a better answer on almost every issue. it's not perfect. And you would think that you could do it rationally, but you can't. So Winston Churchill once said, the Americans always find the right answer after trying everything else. And certainly we do try everything. And then eventually the correct answer comes together in one of these syntheses. Buddha's, let's see. And so Dixon asked also, do you see it as a positive or a negative one? It's both. It's both positive and negative, and it might be very painful. I mean, this is literally how the Godhead does his business. And so if we, and you know, tongue in cheek, I refer to it as bumper cars. We bump into each other in various ways, and gradually the traffic starts to go smoothly around the circle until somebody starts to bump again, and that inevitably happens. Buddha's breath says, I think Lucifer represents reasoning intellect, a means for God to test the angels' artificial intelligence. Well, yeah, I'm not saying what about artificial intelligence taking our place anytime soon. And as soon as we give data emotion, then we're on our way, but so far not. And I'm still thinking about your comment, Buddha's breath, about I think Lucifer represents reasoning intellect, a means for God to test the angels. Yeah, it's not artificial intelligence. It's just the painful way we learn, I think. That might be another way of saying it. Joshua says, for what my opinion is worth, my thoughts on Lucifer is that he was an inevitable and necessary antithesis to what God represents, although God has his dark side and Lucifer has his light side. Well, quite right. I mean, everything is a set of opposites, except for God himself, who is wholeness entirely. And so God had two sons. One was Lucifer and one was Christ. And Lucifer was actually the eldest son, because he appears in Genesis as the snake. So, you know, nothing happens without the dark side. And you know, if you look at the caduceus, which is in the seal of the American Medical Society, many other medical organizations, the two snakes, one represents good and one represents poison, and they're constantly interweaving themselves back and forth. And so if you think of that as a psychic thing that's going on, where there are snakes in your psyche and they're going back and forth, and sometimes it's poison and sometimes it's purity and helping you, that would be a way to look at it. That's the way the opposites interact until there is a conjunctio. And so if there ever is a conjunctio, and sometimes there are at smaller levels, like when a man and woman get together and form a child, for example, that's a conjunctio at a lower level. But at upper levels, if there's ever a conjunctio, then everything is going to go away. And that's actually what Buddhism calls for. It's Buddhism, when you meditate, you're trying to go beyond the opposites or above the opposites. And so let's see. Buddha's rest says, I think God is just the alter ego of the devil. The real deal is the devil. Well, there's two real deals. If you are a Buddhist, then you should know that. And that God is really the pleroma, or Rigpa from a Buddhist point of view. I just came from a Buddhist meditation class, so I do know something about that. So good and evil are always afoot in the world, and we can only hope that good prevails. But unfortunately, we've put into human hands the ability to destroy all life on the planet now. And, and even Jesus Christ was aware of this problem, because in 1 John 4:1, he says you have to be able to test the spirits. In other words, whatever spirit is coming up in your psyche to get you to do something, there's good and evil spirits, and you need a strong enough ego to select between the two. And we often see egos that aren't able to decide for the good. And then we have to do things to try to adjust their attitude. And there's an old Pennsylvania Dutch saying, I wish I had this at my fingertips. I'll have to tape it on my computer somewhere. But it's an old Pennsylvania Dutch prayer that says, Dear God, please let me do my best and protect me from evil. And if you can't protect me from evil, please break his leg, or something like that, so we may know him by his limp. So, anyway, I'm just talking at this point, so I'm going to go to more questions. Vixen Dixon says, Lucifer gets such a bad press. I dread hearing the word nirvana. Well, so do I, because nirvana is nothingness, and obviously life goes on. And, the way Dr. Edward Edinger interpreted this is that Buddha was on the self end of a scale with Christ on the ego end, and that on the self end, the farther out you go, you get to nirvana or the pleroma. But in my interpretation, on the Buddhist side, there's a tendency to be too passive and say, oh, well, it's all just an illusion. And so, I'm not sure what the right answer is, honestly, but somewhere on the scale between the two, we need both. We need the ability to do the best for our families and for our societies, and we need the ability to leave well enough alone to let others live their lives and learn their lessons. And so the way I often put it with respect to American politics is we have every nationality, racial group, and attitude in our country that exist in the world. And so we have the opportunity to select the best ideas from every group Whereas in other countries, let's say Turkey, they don't have the ability to choose from every possibility. But in the United States, we do. And so sometimes we select something that everybody thinks is a good thing. Example would be Starbucks. I mean, it's so good that it's also been adopted around the world. And even though Mr. Schultz was an avowed Zionist, still there, from my own personal experience, there are 4 Starbucks cafes in Prince Faisal Hospital or King Faisal Hospital in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. And so that's a good idea and everybody can adopt it. Most people feel that slavery is a bad idea. And so we had a civil war over the issue. It's not dead in many ways. There are both apparent slaves and other kinds of slaves around the world still today, but most people will tell you that they think it's a bad idea. And so we try to stamp it out. Nonetheless, it gets sublimated so that, for example, when you have for-profit prisons and there's an incentive to send young kids to jail for a long time so that they then work for very significantly below minimum wage, which is what happens. And then that's slavery of a different form. And we all have to consider that. But we have a better chance in the United States of selecting the best ideas of the world and arguing out of the system the worst ideas. And other people don't have that opportunity. And so that allows bad ideas to prevail much longer in other countries, and it holds their countries back. So, I mean, just think of Saudi Arabia and the fact that until recently they didn't allow any women to work in Saudi Arabia. It meant, among other things, that they had to import a lot of nurses from outside of Saudi Arabia, mainly from India and the Philippines. And so it caused many problems in their society. But they're giving up half the brain power of their country by not allowing women to work. So, is that a good idea? Well, maybe it is, considering everything in Saudi Arabia. It wouldn't be a good idea in the United States any longer. So Buddha's rest says nirvana is God being in denial, it's hell. Well, nirvana is way farther out than that. Nirvana is nothingness. If someone could comprehend it, they wouldn't exist and would be aware of their non-existence. Well, actually, they wouldn't be aware of their non-existence. There just would be no non-existence. Yeah. And so, anyway, so we each have to make our decision about what are good ideas and what are bad ideas in our country. And we have many choices on that scale right now. But I'm going to leave it at that for now because I have to go pick up my wife from her work, and she has only 2 more days of actual work before she retires. So she's thrilled, and I got to get her, save her from what's going on. So anyway, thank you for being here today, and I look forward to seeing you tonight. We'll be on tonight on a general discussion panel beginning at 8 p.m. So look forward to seeing you then. Bye.